It was one of the most sinister crimes ever committed in British Columbia. The investigation begins in the cold, powerful waters of the Fraser River near Vancouver and ends in a crack house that is as well known to police as it is to the addicts and sex trade workers who gather there. The resulting trial will be one of the most difficult ever held in the province. In 2001, RCMP Detective Peter Cross is the lead investigator assigned to a particularly mysterious case, what is commonly referred to as a John Doe homicide.
We had some information that somebody had been killed inside a house in the north part of Surrey.
On May 12th, 2001, an individual came forward to the police, and he wasn't an informant, he was a witness, and he spoke of having viewed not a person being killed, but the aftermath of such.
We were investigating that even though we had no idea who the victim was. There was pretty good information.
The house where John Doe was reported to have died is located in Whalley, a low-income neighborhood in Surrey. It's a rundown area and has a high level of crime and violence because of the number of drug addicts who continue to feed their habit. The investigators decide to request a warrant to search the house.
When we searched the house originally, we did it in such a way as the occupants of the house didn't necessarily know what we were looking for.
While conducting the search, the investigators make some gruesome discoveries. Peter Cross dubs it the House of Horrors.
The reason it became termed the House of Horrors is that we eventually did search warrants on the residence, on 2 different occasions, actually. And on one occasion, we went in and looked for fingerprints, for blood, for anything along those lines. And some of those, the blood impressions were pretty graphic because one was a palm print, on a floorboard in blood. So you know that this is not something that's the result of somebody using needles or something. It's something that's the result of a crime.
The house is a disaster and should be demolished.
Inside it was totally shabby and run down.
There's food everywhere, there's garbage everywhere, there's property everywhere. Filthy clothes and cigarette butts and empty alcohol bottles and cans and drug paraphernalia, and it's filthy.
We found piles and piles of new clothes with tags on them. So obviously they're stealing the clothes in exchange for the dope. It was what normally you'd encounter in what they call the crack shack.
There were a number of drug users in the residence at the time, as well as the tenant and some of his associates.
According to police, the tenant, Joe Lagasse, was the person running the house and dealing the drugs. Some people come forward with disturbing information.
They were telling horrendous stories about the torture, where if they didn't come up with the $25 or $50 they needed, that they would get their hair cut, or they get a finger broken, or they'd be made to have sex with other people in the house. I've been on the job 30 years, so you see a lot of violence. I think the concentrated form of this violence in this one house to what these sex trade workers were going through is the kind of file that sticks with you because of that, and the level of violence for such little money.
When you combine that with the information that we're getting from all these people on the street about how people are being beaten and tortured in that residence, it kind of gives you a good picture of what might be happening.
One of the women at the house during the search offers some particularly troubling information to the investigators.
She was a heroin addict, very down and out, and in the midst of her interview, she broke down and she finally told us, I know about the homicide. and started referring to the victim as a she as opposed to a he. And that kind of cued everybody in that something else was going on here. And we felt that she was reliable. She had a lot of good information.
The woman said she was at the house a few weeks earlier when a girl was being tortured in the bathtub.
She actually walked in to use the bathroom when this was going on. So that was the main tie-in, the primary evidence that we had at that time.
Because of her confession, a number of other drug addicts overcome their fear and come forward with their own information about the incident.
These people were all really scared. Talking to the police in that world is not looked upon fondly, and they all feel very endangered by it. So it was a struggle to get any information from anybody, but that's predominantly how we started understanding that at least one other person had been killed there.
And we were about 2 or 3 weeks into that investigation when the body floated up in New Westminster.
In June of 2001, a passerby discovers a body floating by the dock in New Westminster Quay, a city near Vancouver. He alerts the police immediately. Forensic Identification Officer Fred Ralston is dispatched to the scene.
It was on June 4th, 2001. I was working a day shift and I just got a phone call that they had recovered a body in the Fraser River, and they just wanted us to come down there and take some photographs before they had taken her out of the river. There were a number of police officers there at the scene, and I noted that there was a body in the river, and it was face down, but it was fairly obvious just from the general outline of the person that it appeared to be female.
Facial features and all those kinds of things are definitely blurred. Of course, water being the most difficult body to find as far as a forensic, because water destroys and animal life destroys what you have fairly quickly.
The current is very strong. The rescuers must work quickly so that the body is not carried away by the river.
Our first concern was to try to get her out of the water without disturbing the body, and more importantly, not letting her go and head down the Fraser River again. So after some discussion, we decided that the dive team from the RCMP would come there and retrieve the body.
The New Westminster Police Department doesn't have its own dive team. The RCMP divers must be brought in.
The feet and hands were bound together. Quite frankly, that's suspicious enough for us to call in homicide. Generally speaking, you don't get anybody trying to commit suicide or trying to drown themselves with their feet and hands tied together. So it was evident to us that this was in fact a homicide, and we had to be very careful in the extraction of the body. We bagged the body in the water. That way we'll preserve things like paper falling out of pockets or perhaps an earring. And then we cut little slits in the bag and let the water rush out that way. The idea, of course, is to get the water out of the bag because water weighs, an awful lot, but it drains in such a way that we can preserve items that might fall out. In this particular case, you want to double that up with a Stokes stretcher so that you can actually control the amount of water that comes out of the bag at any given time. Once the body's up on dry land, it's almost immediately turned over to the homicide investigators.
Detective Constable Meaden and myself, we went down, followed the body down to the Royal Columbian Hospital morgue, and we went in there for obvious reasons, just to see if there was a wallet or anything on her that would tell us who she was.
Many questions remain unanswered. How did the victim end up in the Fraser River? How long has the body been in the water? Will an autopsy be able to determine the victim's identity? The RCMP are investigating the murder of a man in a crack house known as the House of Horrors. They learn a woman has been beaten in the bathroom of the same house. At the same time, a body is discovered floating in the waters of the Fraser River near Vancouver, British Columbia. The body is transported to the morgue at the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. The pathologist conducts an autopsy on the badly decomposing body.
Une autopsie médico-légale.
A forensic autopsy involves a number of steps. When the body arrives, the first step is an external examination. We look at the clothes and the skin. We're looking for signs of cuts or tears in the clothes, or signs of trauma in the skin. Is there any evidence there? Are there fragments of fiber that were torn from the attacker? Are there any body fluids from the attacker, blood or semen? So we might take samples of any number of different things found on the clothes and skin. Then we undress the body, and we go through the same procedure without the clothes.
When the body bag is opened, the sex is confirmed, but nothing is found that might help identify the woman.
Bodies in water, especially when it's cold, probably decompose less than if you had the body on the outside where it's exposed to the elements. She actually had a piece of the packaging tape wrapped around the back of her head, through her mouth, and then around to the back of her head again. So her face was distorted quite a bit.
She was wearing a sweater and a pair of jeans, which might not have that much significance, except for the jeans were very obviously not her pants. They were brand new pants. They still had stickers and tags on them, and they were too small. Somebody had had a struggle actually putting this clothing on her.
7 stab wounds were found on the woman's arms, back, and thighs. Yet there is no evidence of cuts or tears in her clothing.
I did look at her hands because I knew that I'd eventually have to fingerprint her, and she had degloved, which is a way of saying that the outer layer of her skin had come off. But even at that, she was in very good shape, and I had no reason to believe that I wouldn't be able to get a good set of fingerprints from her that would be identifiable.
Le liquide qui s'accumule dans le corps à cause de la
As a result of decomposition, moisture accumulates in the body between the outer layer of the skin, the epidermis, and a deeper layer called the dermis. And the epidermis becomes detached. Around the hands, we are left with something like a glove, which must be removed very, very carefully. The forensic expert puts on a latex glove to protect their hand and then fits the salvaged skin over it in order to take the fingerprints. If this skin glove has been lost in the water and we have been unable to retrieve it, the forensic expert can still take fingerprints from the dermis. It's not as effective, but it still works.
The victim's hands and ankles have been tied with yellow rope.
They might be some unusual knot that a person might link to some particular job or hobby. And if it's preserved properly, the knot specialist can look at it and maybe give us some information.
The rope bindings we took some interest in and spent a little time on that. We sent those off actually to a rope expert to determine knots and how they were tied, and we try to use that as a tie-in later on in the investigation.
Once the victim's hands are untied, the forensic technician can start taking fingerprints.
First at the postmortem, it was not possible to get a good set of fingerprints from her, so unfortunately we had to remove all of the fingers. As soon as we were finished the postmortem, we came back and we got 4 digits that were very, very good.
Often when we find someone like that and we don't know who they are, that's the first thing we'll check. It's the easiest, because if they've ever been involved in the justice system, we'll have their fingerprints on file. The only other reason we do it is for other people who pass away and we already know their identity. If they do have a criminal record, we'll take their fingerprints simply to send them into Ottawa so they can be removed from the national databank.
Fred Rolston sends the prints from the 4 digits to the Vancouver database for verification. No matches are found. so the prints are sent on to be checked against the national database in Ottawa. Despite Rolston's efforts, the second search yields nothing.
I spent some time again, and I got all 10 digits, contacted Ottawa. It took them maybe a couple hours, and they came back, and again, it was negative. I was disappointed because I felt if she'd been fingerprinted previously, there was no reason why they couldn't identify her, but they didn't.
The fingerprints provide no leads. Have the investigators come up against the perfect crime? The team must now look for other clues that might reveal the woman's identity.
There was a large scorpion tattoo with red eyes, and I think there was 2 red dots in the tail on her upper left shoulder. The scorpion tattoo was kind of the thing that we focused on in the early stages of the investigation as a possible means of identifying her.
They are now banking on the scorpion tattoo. Despite the condition of the body, they are able to take a clear photo. They release it to the media throughout the province. In the meantime, Constable Rolston receives fingerprints from 4 people who have been reported missing. He compares them to the victim's fingerprints. Once again, there are no matches. Then he receives another lead.
Finally, someone had phoned in and said that there was a missing person in Coquitlam that they hadn't seen for some time, so had one of our members go over to Coquitlam, pick up the prints, and brought them back.
A week has now passed since the body was discovered, and the investigators are still empty-handed. Will this latest lead help them solve the mystery of the victim's identity? A woman's body is found in the Fraser River near a dock in New Westminster, British Columbia. It's badly decomposed. The arms and legs are tied. The investigators have just received the fingerprints of a missing woman from the neighboring city of Coquitlam. This time, the prints match. The woman can finally be identified. Her name is Annette Allen.
I know that she was from Saskatchewan. I believe that she had a mom still in Saskatchewan, and I believe that she had a brother as well.
Annette has lived in British Columbia for some time, but she has no family there. Her disappearance was never reported.
She had started dating an individual who was heavy into drug use and the drug trade, and he went off to jail actually a short time after they started dating, and Annette moved into a relative's of his because she came and went and wasn't very consistent with the way that she lived her life. The lady that she was living with didn't even realize that she was missing until her body was found, and they broadcast through the media the pictures of the tattoos.
In cases like this, especially where there is trauma that may have contributed to the death, it is standard procedure to order toxicology tests. The results reveal high levels of drugs in Annette's system, consistent with those of a drug addict.
She did have what would be a textbook lethal dosage of heroin in her system. She also had cocaine and I believe alcohol.
Once Annette's identity is discovered, the New Westminster Police Department contacts Peter Cross. They believe there is a connection to the John Doe case he is currently working on.
And so we investigated a little further, and we were able to tie the girl to this particular house that we were already investigating.
The case is immediately transferred to the Surrey detachment of the RCMP, and Peter Cross becomes the lead investigator. The investigators learn that Annette Allen used to frequent The Stroll, an area of Whalley where prostitutes ply their trade. They also discover that she was with a woman named Joanna Larson on April 22nd, the day she was last seen alive.
Joanna Larson had brought her to that house. And the information at that time was that Joanna Larson had a beef with Annette Allen. And there's where sort of the real crux of the investigation started. What happened in that house?
It was linked quite quickly that she had passed away in that house or that it had started there.
The investigators still do not have enough evidence to make an arrest. So a second, more thorough search of the house is ordered.
We took the drain pipes out of the house. We did everything. I would say we spent in total probably 2.5, 3 days examining that house.
Peter Cross has heard disturbing rumors about the backyard of the House of Horrors.
We had so much information of people coming forward, the street people in particular. We thought we've got to cover this off. There's just too many people talking about bodies in the backyard.
For this second search, he decides to use an untried technology called ground-penetrating radar. At the time, Cross is one of the first people in his detachment to use it.
You can use it for pretty well anything. What you get is just like a radar image that you would see on a scope that you see when they're running radar anywhere. And it will bring out the shape and size. So if you're looking for a coffin or you're looking for a shotgun, the shape will actually come back at you. And what it measures is the disturbances in the soil. If you're looking for a body, it's going to show up as a body.
The radar reveals no sign of bodies buried in the backyard.
Well, we sort of came to the conclusion that this was one of the ways they threatened people that were coming into the house.
The second search warrant leads to the discovery of 27 DNA profiles in the house. But it does not yield a single trace of Annette Allen or any evidence of her murder. Either the informants are lying, or someone has done a very thorough job of covering up their crime.
To this day, we have still 27 unknown DNA profiles. All those DNA profiles are blood profiles. So that's blood that's been expended in that house from 27 different people. And we still have yet to tie it into anybody in particular.
The House of Horrors is shut down, and Joe Lagasse is arrested and charged as an accessory to the murder of Annette Allen. But he is quickly released.
After the preliminary hearing, I decided the evidence simply wasn't there in regards to Lagasse, so he was not charged on indictment with murder or manslaughter.
Although he was a promising suspect, Lagasse now walks away a free man.
It was a legal decision as opposed to a common sense decision, in my opinion, because of the legal loopholes in what his role was. I think the average member of the public, when they hear what his role was, they would say, well, of course he's guilty. The problem is the legal system doesn't necessarily match up to what the average Joe thinks.
The only leads the investigators have left are eyewitness accounts that point to two possible suspects, Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier.
Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier would be considered friends. Francis was kind of the doorman of that house, worked and lived there, and Jojo went there all the time. We had information which made us believe that the two of them had actually discussed committing a homicide, and that they kind of jibed at each other at points saying, oh, you couldn't kill anybody, or you couldn't do it.
The witnesses are drug addicts, and this does not help matters. Peter Cross is not sure their accounts are reliable.
The nature of their drug illness makes them extremely difficult to deal with and extremely difficult to corroborate their information and count on.
Cross decides to forge ahead with what little information he has.
The investigative avenue we thought would work and would be our best avenue was the undercover route.
The first undercover operation targets Joanna Larson. It's not long before she's providing information about her role in the death of Annette Allen.
She was definitely, in my opinion, a braggart. Like, she was quite pleased to talk about it.
It turns out that Larson had previously taken part in a robbery and was convinced that Allen had been an informant.
We could confirm later on, obviously, that she wasn't in that case, but that was their belief, was that she was ratting them out.
There was also a $20 drug debt in there too, that Annette owed someone $20, and that this was a bit of a point of contention with Joanna as well. Annette showed up and they kind of coerced her into the house on the premise that, you know, she was going to be given some drugs. And I think it was pretty immediate after she entered the house, and that they tied her up and put her in the bathtub.
Annette Allen is assaulted, stabbed, and beaten with a hammer. Larson boasts about the part she played in the attack, but says a man named Francis Gauthier was the instigator.
Basically, Joanna Larson confessed to being there and what happened, but put the majority of the blame on Mr. Gauthier.
But Larson's accusation against Gauthier would not be admissible in a court of law. In order for it to be used as evidence, a confession from Gauthier himself would be required.
They knew, certainly, for sure, they knew Gauthier was involved. One thing to know someone's involved, it's another thing to have evidence that you can use against that person. So that's why the second undercover operation was used.
Joanna Larson is arrested and charged with the murder of Annette Allen. Police launched the undercover operation targeting Francis Gauthier.
The challenge, of course, was hoping that they didn't somehow come together once we'd started the second, so that one would talk to the other as to what was going on.
Will Gauthier be as quick as Larson to give information to the undercover operator? Will his story be the same? Will police get the evidence they need to arrest Annette Allen's killer? The body of Annette Allen has been retrieved from the Fraser River. Her death is traced back to a crack house located in Surrey, British Columbia, that police refer to as the House of Horrors. However, 2 searches have not turned up the slightest trace of Annette's DNA in the house. The investigators have completed an undercover operation targeting Joanna Larson. Armed with the allegations Larson has made about Francis Gauthier, the police launch a second undercover operation.
He was introverted, quiet, not very comfortable with himself.
Obviously, he has some violent tendencies to do what he did, but you don't get that same sort of killer impression from Francis Gauthier that you get from Joanna Larson.
I think it was a little bit more difficult for him to talk about it, but in the end, he seemed quite pleased with himself as well.
Gauthier eventually recounts his versions of the events.
He was sleeping on the couch when Joanna Larson brought Annette Allen to this house and began torturing her.
According to Gauthier, Annette Allen arrived at the house to buy drugs. As soon as she arrived, Larson forced her into the bathroom and started torturing, stabbing, and beating her. The torture continues for many hours. When she's had enough, she recruits Francis Gauthier to help her trunk Allen.
What was referred to on the street as being trunked, and that term referred to being beaten, having your head shaven, and being thrown in a trunk and driven around as, you know, a form of punishment or a way of convincing you that you need to pay your bills.
Annette is unconscious and barely alive. Francis and Joanna wrap her in a plastic shower curtain. Then they lock her in a trunk of a car that is parked beside the house.
This residence also had normally multiple cars parked in the driveway, most of them without license plates or insurance, and it was kind of typical to have one good set of license plates and you just switch that to whichever car you chose to drive that day.
Initially, it was still daylight, so they waited for a while down in the Surrey area, the North Surrey area.
Larson and Gauthier drive around for several hours looking for a suitable place to dump Allen. They stop under the Alex Fraser Bridge. A heated argument erupts. While the two accomplices try to come to a decision, Allen manages to open the trunk. Larson and Gauthier realize what's happening, and they tie her up before heading back out. In their state of panic, they don't notice that they've been spotted. The man goes home and calls 911 to report what he witnessed. Eventually, Larson and Gauthier end up in New Westminster.
Right at the New Westminster Quay. It was about 100 yards up from where the body was found.
Allen begs them not to kill her. Gauthier strangles her. He and Larson throw her body into the Fraser River. Gauthier's confession to the undercover agents is the evidence the police need to lay charges against him. Gauthier is arrested for the murder of Annette Allen. The arrests of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier brings Peter Cross closer to his goal. But he knows he still has his biggest challenge ahead of him, putting the offenders behind bars. What makes this case especially difficult is the fact that the witnesses and informants are drug addicts.
From an investigator's standpoint, it's horrendous. And then when you get into the court process, it becomes even more horrendous.
Totally unreliable. You might as well forget them coming in for an interview. If they do, it's a bit of a miracle. Unlikely to come to the court, even though they know they're supposed to. So you'd have to send the police off to pick them up and bring them in.
We have a lot of challenges with memory, recollection, how cognizant people were when the incidents occurred, fear, intimidation.
We were told from the very beginning, you'll never get this to court because the people will never come through it. Unless somebody's willing to step forward, you do not have a case. And it's a very difficult thing to prove.
Peter Cross and his team have an enormous task ahead of them. They begin preparing for the trials of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier. Christopher McPherson is selected as Crown Prosecutor. His extensive experience as a defense lawyer dealing with drug addicts makes him the ideal person to prosecute this case.
Maybe that gave us a bit of an advantage in the sense of I've dealt with people like this for years and years and years in my office or interviewing them.
His experience also tells him he is facing an uphill battle in the case of Annette Allen.
We knew there were problems with it from the get-go. Sure, there was tape and there was rope and there was clothing, but none of that could be tied back to the house in any way. It was just basic stuff you could get anywhere. There was nothing that one could say was the weapons that were used in the assault. There were knives in the house, but there was nothing that you could say was used. The beating and stabbing took place in a bathroom, in the tub, and there was certainly evidence of cleaning up with bleach and things like that. I think, as I recall, I checked the trap of the tub, couldn't find anything. There was basically no physical evidence to tie Annette Allen to the house at all.
Even though Annette had been wrapped in plastic, he finds it very surprising that investigators were unable to find any forensic evidence in the car.
If we could have put Annette Allen in that car with a forensic evidence, that would have made the case a lot stronger.
Without any forensic evidence whatsoever, the prosecution's success will depend on two things: the undercover operations and the accounts of drug-addicted witnesses, both of which present significant problems. In Larson's case, it is by no means certain whether the information gathered during the undercover operation will be admissible in court. Some of the things she said contradict the evidence collected when the body was recovered.
Because they were so drug addicted, just their sheer recollection or perception is just skewed. They don't remember things. So even if they're not trying to lie, it's like they don't have a complete grasp of what's going on around them anyways.
With no forensic evidence and unreliable witnesses, the odds are heavily stacked against the prosecution. Three people have been charged in relation to the death of Annette Allen. Her body was found in the Fraser River in New Westminster, British Columbia in June of 2001. Joe Lagasse has been acquitted for lack of evidence connecting him to the murder. The prosecution is preparing cases against Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson. The suspects and the witnesses are heavily addicted to drugs, and this complicates the case considerably. Since these are the only witnesses available to the prosecution, one obvious solution presents itself. Investigators take the witnesses under their care and enroll them in a detox program so that they'll be able to participate fully in the trial.
It's up to the cop to increase the credibility of the drug addict turned witness, and one of the best ways to do this is to convince and assist the addict in abstaining for at least the duration of the court process. And hopefully they can provide the support services they need to remain sober.
It's not an easy task, but it's certainly worth a try.
They did an amazing job with 2 or 3 of the witnesses and making sure they were always there for them, taking them for coffee after, and keeping them on the straight and narrow, giving them a place to call if they started to feel like they were going to slip down to the other side.
I've got to give the police a lot of credit, because even though, it's a killing in the middle of for the whole drug scene, they worked very, very hard and continued to work very hard right through the whole case. Because it was one of those cases that, okay, you've got enough evidence to charge a person, well, that's nice, but half your witnesses aren't going to come.
But one of the witnesses that the investigators support becomes a key witness in the trial.
She was a woman who came to the house to buy drugs.
And had to use the washroom, and when she went in, Annette was in the bathtub. And she saw her.
There is one issue that complicates the case even more: determining the cause of death.
One of the issues that came in court was the levels of toxicity in her body with the various drugs. One of the defense arguments was that the drugs killed her. So that became an issue in court because we basically had to show that she was a drug addict, and therefore her levels of this, it wasn't like the average person taking drugs for the first time.
And, you know, yeah, she still had a really high level of drugs in her system at the time of her death. So there are lots of questions like that. You know, were they injecting her with drugs? Is that not what actually happened? You know, was the time span much less than what they described? And you have to crack it up to they were both using drugs at the time too, and you know, how accurate are those time frames?
One thing I find whenever there's witnesses who are heavily addicted to drugs, time is completely elastic. To try to figure out when something occurred approaches the impossible.
The prosecution has no tangible evidence, no cause of death, and unreliable witnesses. Finally, the trial date arrives, and the first person on the stand is Francis Gauthier. Following their preliminary hearings, which are several months apart, Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Annette Allen.
It wasn't a case that improved with time. Some of the witnesses became even less reliable. And I eventually agreed to take pleas to manslaughter on both of them.
The Crown was willing to take a plea with regard to manslaughter because predominantly when all of your witnesses are precariously perched on the edge of being able to testify and not being able to testify, if you go to trial and you have 10 so-so witnesses and defense starts taking them down and ruining their credibility, you can often end up with no good witnesses.
On November 5th, 2004, Francis Gauthier is sentenced to 18 years in prison for manslaughter. On June 2nd, 2005, Joanna Larson also receives 18 years. The court's decision represents an enormous victory for everyone involved in solving Annette Allen's murder.
We all had a relationship with Annette Allen in the sense that we thought that she was a legitimate victim and that this never should have happened, and it was tragic and horrific.
We were pretty pleased with the 18 years when it all is said and done, because that's probably at the very high end of manslaughter that you'll ever see.
I feel great every time I think about it, that it ended the way it did and that people went to jail and there was some justice for her death. For sure, my biggest lesson ever in being a police officer is that every one of those people have a story and a reason for where they are. And if you actually just sit down and listen, you're gonna maybe have a little bit more understanding and appreciation for the spot they're in.
We had a good investigative team. We did a good job on that file. It's one of those files that you're proud of at the end of the day. It's one of those files that you get asked about all the time. It's one of those files that people remember, that hit the media and the general public knows of it. And it's one of those cases where you actually see some good come of everything that you did.
The outcome of the trial has repercussions in the community.
We saw an impact on that little Wally community where nobody seemed to pay attention to them, and the neighbors constantly complained that the police wouldn't take them seriously.
The mayor, at the end of this, bulldozed the house and destroyed it. And I think it was kind of a symbolic gesture to say, we're taking care of these things and these crack shacks are going to be disposed of and dealt with accordingly.
To this day, the John Doe case is still being investigated. As years pass, hope fades that his death will ever be resolved. Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier believed that they could outsmart the investigators in Annette Allen's case. But for them, water proved to be an unreliable accomplice. On the morning of Saturday, October 14th, 1995, 70 kilometers east of Vancouver, British Columbia, the peaceful town of Abbotsford is plunged into a nightmare when a fisherman discovers a young woman's mutilated, naked body in the Vedder River. The long hunt begins for the murderer, a man who will terrorize the community for months. He will profoundly affect the people of this town and will capture the attention of the national press, who will dub him the Abbotsford killer. It's Friday the 13th of October. Misty Cockerill and her friend Tanya Smith are on their way home from a party. But instead, the two 16-year-olds decide to continue their evening and go to another party nearby. On the way, their lives will be changed forever. When Misty regains consciousness a few hours later, the attacker has disappeared. So has her friend Tanya. With great difficulty, she drags herself to the hospital a few blocks away. Rod Gale is the lead investigator for the Abbotsford police.
Duty sergeant gave me a call and told me that there had been a young girl come into the MSA hospital and she was badly beaten, and she was telling the nurses there that her friend was still missing. At that point, we called out a couple of teams of detectives and our investigation began.
Misty's skull is fractured and she needs immediate surgery. She struggles to talk to the detectives as she drifts in and out of consciousness.
Tanya was out by the school is what she was telling us, so we had a group of officers over searching in the area of the school to see if we could find Tanya.
There is no trace of Tanya. Did she manage to escape? Or did the assailant take her with him? Police fear the worst. At 8 a.m., a man is salmon fishing in the Vedder River, about 15 kilometers outside of Abbotsford. Suddenly, something floating nearby in the shallow waters attracts his attention. As he gets closer, he discovers the naked, lifeless body of a young woman.
I was at the hockey rink with my son, and I received a page from my office. And I subsequently called back to my office and got some details. And then I spoke to the Abbotsford police about an incident they had as well.
The Abbotsford police send a picture of Tanya Smith to Inspector McLeod, who is the lead investigator for the RCMP. He arrives at the Vedder River with Detective Kevin Hackett.
When I arrived there, the police had cordoned off the area where the body had been recovered, brought ashore, and was covered.
Inspector McLeod confirms that the victim is indeed Tanya Smith, the 16-year-old reported missing by her friend Misty. McLeod and Hackett examine the victim.
We were concerned about the damage that water could do to forensic evidence, DNA evidence, saliva, washing away some fabric or fiber evidence that could be crucial. So an important process is to ensure that the hands are bagged with paper bags, because in a struggle, they may defend themselves and strike back at an attacker, and if they scratch the attacker, they'll get DNA under their fingernails. The body is placed in a body bag that protects it from the outside environment in an effort to stop any contamination from outside sources. And then it's transported to the morgue, where it's locked in a crypt.
Detective McLeod searches the area for evidence and makes an interesting discovery.
There was another scene located just to the south of where the body was recovered, in that it was a pathway that went down to the water. And at the entrance to that path, what turned out to be Tanya's clothes had been thrown up in the bushes. And there were some indications on the ground that that's where her body had been placed in the water.
The investigators are intrigued by the fact that the murderer has chosen to display the victim's clothing.
I think it was clear that he wanted her body to be discovered, so that may be part of that. His criminal mindset was to deposit the body when he knew that he would not be detected with it, but it would be found the following day when the river would be filled with fishermen.
There were some tire impressions found, and there were some drag marks, what appear to be drag marks on the ground.
Still in hospital, Misty is fighting for her life. But the police are anxious for her recollection of the attack. She's seen her assailant, and she knows where the attack took place.
We sent a detective there with a tape recorder, and the instruction was tape record everything she said. She had been coherent enough to share information. She deteriorated later on to the point where she was giving information that was incoherent. She had what the doctors described to us as at least 3 home run type swings to the head. Her hand was broken, her arm was injured badly, her skull was badly enough indented into her brain that she had bleeding to her brain.
With such severe injuries, the detectives realize that Misty's memory may be vague and unreliable, but she is their only lead. In medical terms, Misty has received a blunt head trauma. Montreal forensic pathologist Dr. Annie Sauvageau explains.
Dans les traumatismes contondants, une des zones, c'est pas la seule, mais une des zones...
Blunt trauma to the head will often erode the scalp, but also cause cuts because the weapon hits the scalp and the bone is underneath. The scalp is caught between 2 hard objects, the weapon and the skull. So the scalp will open, it will tear. That's what we call a laceration. If the weapon strikes hard enough, the skull will also break and you'll have a skull fracture. Whether the skull breaks or not, the brain may be damaged and blood may pool around the brain. This blood will cover the brain and it may cause a chemical irritation, making the brain swell. So if we have a brain that is swelling but no holes in the skull, the brain will try to find a way to eliminate the excess pressure. That excess will come out through holes in the base called the foramen magnum, where the marrow is generally located. So bits of brain go there, but there is still not enough room for the swelling brain, and it compresses important centers that control the respiration, the pulse, and the blood vessels. And this can lead to death.
The doctors and police are amazed that Misty managed to get to the hospital with such severe injuries.
The remarkable thing about it was that the attack happened at about midnight, 12:30, and she never came into the hospital until about 4:30 in the morning. She'd been lying outside on the ground, and she managed to find her way around to the front to the emergency ward and stumbled through the doors. And that was, of course, a question that we had. We thought perhaps somebody even had helped her to get there. She was beaten so badly.
In an effort to find witnesses or information relating to the crime, the police issue a press release and set up a tip line call center. In the meantime, investigators try to piece together statements made by Misty to help them locate the crime scene.
What we had from Misty was she was over by the school in the bushes. So that's a fairly large area which included behind the hospital. And we had detective teams going through the bushes area, behind the hospital, behind the school, and all down that particular street.
After 3 days, there's still no trace of the attack site. Given her critical condition, could Misty have inadvertently misled them? The town of Abbotsford, British Columbia is in mourning. 2 young girls have been violently attacked on their way to a party. Misty Cockerill barely escaped the attacker and is in critical condition in the hospital under police protection. 16-year-old Tanya Smith has been found dead in a river, her body beaten and mutilated. The police are still looking for the scene where the attack took place.
It wasn't, in fact, until the morning of the 18th, 4 days later, that we were able to establish the actual attack site by finding a hoop earring that had been knocked off of Misty.
The attack site is finally confirmed, in spite of the fact that the rain has washed away the girl's blood.
It was late at night, but there are residents in that area. There were people that heard screams, and at least 2 witnesses that heard a female voice saying, "No, no, no." Nobody phoned the police, however, but that's not unusual either. So it's a high-risk attack and high-risk area. Sometimes that's part of the thrill of it for these guys.
That same day, police receive a report of an object that may be of interest, located not far from the Vedder River.
A local farmer that knew we were looking for evidence out in that area phoned in and said, I can see a baseball bat floating in the ditch. Don't think it was there yesterday.
Misty had told the police that her assailant beat her with a baseball bat. Could this be the weapon used during the attack on Misty and Tanya? The police have the bat examined by RCMP Forensics. That same day, Inspector McLeod answers a call on the tip line.
The first time he called, I was in the command room and picked up the tip line.
At the other end of the line, a man claims to be the person who found Misty and helped her get to the hospital. Inspector McLeod tries to obtain more information, but the man hangs up without identifying himself. The stranger was using a public payphone, and the police were unable to trace the call. Later in the afternoon, another call astounds the police. The same man who spoke earlier with Inspector McLeod now gives details regarding the body of the victim found in the river. He claims to be Tanya Smith's killer and proves it by mentioning details that were not released to the public.
It's not likely that it could have been done by anyone else other than the perpetrator. The information, the main piece of holdback information that we had was the location of the bite on Tanya's body. And the caller, when he called us, always referred to that area of the bite as his calling card, so to speak.
This time, the call is traced back to a payphone at the Abbotsford Arena. Police and the Forensic Identification Unit are immediately dispatched.
We were getting the information within minutes. For the timing of the phone call being made and the time it took to drive to the exit, we feel that the first police responders must have met him as he was driving out. The response was that quick. Unfortunately, it didn't identify him.
Telephone receivers generally are quite greasy and dirty, and you may get prints on top of prints. Hard to determine if it's one individual or not. It's a public area, and you're not going to get good results. But to actually find something that's usable is pretty slim.
Early that evening, the tips line receives another call from the killer. This time, he mocks the police and laughs at their inability to catch him.
One of his phone calls to us, he said, "Do you think I'd be stupid enough to leave fingerprints behind when I made a phone call?" And that led us to believe that he was watching us dust the payphone where the 911 call was made.
The same evening, the killer calls a fourth time. He continues to taunt the investigators and admits he's looking for new victims. He wants to kill again. To help apprehend the killer, a telecommunications company develops a new technology to assist the investigation.
They were able to put in a remote answering system that would show us when a 911 call was coming into our dispatch center from a payphone. And before the dispatcher answered that call, he or she would be able to tell where that phone call was coming from, which payphone it was coming from, and dispatch a car to be attending there, and then answer the 911 call and talk to the person. And during the time that they were talking to the person, there would be a police car en route to this 911 call.
We saturated the streets of Abbotsford with as many investigative teams as we possibly could in anticipation he was going to call. In those areas that he had called in the past, so that if there was a call, we could respond quickly, and we did.
Patrol cars arrive on the site shortly after the call, but the killer escapes once again. The police make another statement to the media, warning the city of Abbotsford that this violent predator is on the loose. They request that women in particular be very careful. The community is gripped by fear. The tip line receives thousands of calls from people wanting to help catch the murderer. The investigators received the results from the analysis of the baseball bat. No DNA evidence was found. The bat cannot be linked to the crime. Misty is still in critical condition, but she is the only one who has seen the murderer. The police send a forensic artist to visit her to create a composite drawing. In her brief moments of consciousness, she describes her assailant. On October 20th, 6 days after the attack, the face of the Abbotsford killer appears in all the newspapers.
We had, of course, released a composite that Misty had assisted in preparing. We had debated about the value of that, given her injuries, but we decided to release that. That generated a lot of tips from the public.
The police follow up on all the tips they receive from the public. It's a long, laborious process. The cause of Tanya's death can only be confirmed with an autopsy. Will the evidence found on her body offer the investigators a solid lead? Detective Kevin Hackett is present at the autopsy.
She had very significant skull fracture. She had trauma to her face. It looked like she'd been beaten around the face. And in her abdomen area, an almost visible footprint with some of the soil that was left. And there was the significant injury, the bite mark to her breast.
Tanya's body was in the river for many hours. It's quite possible that the water has washed away precious evidence. Could the analysis of the bite mark help identify the murderer? Will it give police the evidence they need to arrest the Abbotsford killer? The town of Abbotsford, British Columbia is in shock. 2 teenage girls have been violently attacked. One is dead, and the other is struggling to stay alive. A man who identifies himself as the murderer has been calling and taunting the police. He has threatened to kill again, spreading terror through the city. Investigators work around the clock searching for leads. The results of Tanya Smith's autopsy may give them the evidence they need to stop the murderer before he claims another victim.
Although Dr. Carlisle believed that the head injuries, brain injuries were so significant that she likely would have died from them, but the official cause was drowning because she was submerged in the water and still inhaling water into her lungs.
The pathologist also finds that the victim has been raped. Samples are sent for DNA profiling. To examine the bite mark on the victim's breast, the police call on Dr. Sweet, a forensic odontologist with an international reputation.
When we collect bite mark evidence, there's a specific protocol that we follow, and it included swabbing the skin as an initial examination, and then looking at the physical evidence that result from the teeth interacting with the skin. We had to photograph the bite mark extensively in order to record those patterns and shapes in reference to a scale or a ruler that's placed near the bite mark. And in addition to that, we take a cast, or we make a mold of the skin so that we can record any undulations or differences in the surface from normal.
Dr. Sweet uses a new technique to collect DNA from the bite mark.
The saliva that is deposited during biting, I thought would be a very good source of DNA evidence. And so I had developed a method of collecting that saliva using 2 swabs, one wet and one dry. Because the victim had been in the water for several hours, there was really no way of knowing what we were going to be able to achieve. It was assumed that the water would have washed away all of the evidence. The swabbing method involves using 2 swabs. The first one is dipped in sterile distilled water to wet it so that the dried stain that's on the surface of the skin can be hydrated and loosened. The discovery that we made when we were developing this method was that there are still cells from the saliva left in contact with the skin after the first swab leaves the surface. So if we could come back with a dry swab, a second separate swab, to act as a sponge, we can collect the water and the remaining cells that are now loose from the skin's surface. We were very surprised when we got a DNA result. And we started to look at why the saliva was acting like this, why after several hours in the water we were still able to obtain a result.
Saliva contains a viscous substance called mucin. That's what held the suspect's DNA on Tanya's skin. Part of the saliva was lost in the river, but there was enough left to produce a partial DNA result. For the investigators, this is an important discovery.
A full DNA profile was produced from the semen sample that was found in the post-coital swab, but a partial DNA profile was produced from the bite mark. But enough of the DNA profile was obtained in order to compare that not only with the semen to show that the same person that had sex with the victim also bit her.
Police hold back this information from the public to ensure that the murderer is not aware of the evidence found. After 12 days of silence, the Abbotsford killer calls the police again. This time, the call comes from a phone booth outside the recreation center. Patrol cars race to the scene, but once again, the killer escapes. The investigation is stalling. The police are aware of the stress on the city, and they have to stop the terror. They turn to forensic psychology.
When the police call on forensic psychologists, it's usually because there's something strange in the behavior of the individual that they can't understand. It's something out of the ordinary. In these cases, they'll ask a psychologist to do a psychological profile of that individual.
There's a danger, though, that you have to be mindful of as an investigator or as a team commander. And the danger is tunnel vision and focusing too much on that profile and ignoring other avenues of investigation or other people of interest or other evidence that doesn't fit with the profile. But it can be a valuable tool, but you have to be very careful in how you use that tool.
Dr. Mike Webster is brought in to prepare a psychological profile of the murderer.
This was a spontaneous act. This was a retaliatory type of crime that he committed here. Any sexual overtones were secondary. They were simply another way to brutalize and dehumanize these girls. This was an act of savage retaliation. Tanya and Misty presented an opportunity for him. He physically intimidated them, and he psychologically intimidated them. part of his motive was to blow off some of this anger, this steam that he had against women. And this is unusual because, I mean, usually when someone commits a crime, post-crime behavior is they want to distance themselves from their crime so that they won't be discovered. In this case, he had a desire to demonstrate to the police that he was smarter than they were, that he could outwit them. And what he had done here by going to the river was in effect create two crime scenes, attempting to complicate matters for the police. The telephone calls that came afterwards, this was his way of involving himself in the investigation. This was his way of maintaining the excitement of the crime by continuing to interact with the police and demonstrate to them that he could outwit them, that he was smarter than they were.
24 days after the attack, the police set up a call-in line where people can listen to samples of the killer's phone calls. They hoped that someone would recognize his voice.
I think what really started to scare the community was when he started making phone calls and taunting us, and then we started to play those on the air. I think it really scared people. And it was quiet around town. You could drive downtown at night and there wasn't a lot of traffic out. You didn't see people out walking. People were scared.
Finally, on December 1st, there is a new development in the investigation.
And we had a suspect that had been arrested on this particular, as being identified as a person responsible for the attacks. And he was a look-alike, a dead ringer for the composite drawing.
The suspect gives a DNA sample and his dental imprint. Have the police arrested the Abbotsford killer? A violent murderer is hiding in the small British Columbian city of Abbotsford. He terrorizes the community, taunts the police, and promises to kill again. Misty Cockerill, one of his young victims, clings to life in hospital. A composite drawing is published in all the newspapers. A recording of the killer's voice is broadcast on radio and television. On December 1st, investigators arrest a man who bears a striking resemblance to the composite drawing. He is well known to police and agrees to give a DNA sample and his dental imprint.
He was really, really quick to give all the DNA and bite mark. We didn't have a fingerprint at that time, but he gave DNA and a bite mark to get himself cleared.
The suspect is held in custody while the DNA samples are examined. In the meantime, the police continue their investigation.
I was asked to record dental impressions on 5 different suspects over a period of about 6 months. I had seen traits in the teeth that were quite characteristic and unique. So I was able to take impressions of those suspects' teeth and within a very short period of time, exclude them as being the cause of the bite mark.
Over the course of the investigation, there was 9,500 tips came in, and most of those were people being identified as possible suspects. So we're getting look-alikes to the composite drawings and sound-alikes to the voice, and people were very, very anxious to help, and we were getting lots of calls. So thousands of suspects were eliminated.
The DNA results are negative, and the suspect is released. He is not the Abbotsford killer. The killer has not contacted the police for weeks. His silence weighs heavily, and his threat to kill again echoes through the streets of the city. On February 17th, the host of a radio show receives an anonymous call. The man tells him to go and look in the parking lot.
Quickly realized that It said Tanya Smith on the gravestone, and there was an embossed picture. And so he called the police right away. And our officers attended and took the headstone as evidence and found that it had been defaced. There was threats scribbled on it to Misty. There was a reference on it to the bite mark. And quite amazingly, nobody saw him lift this big 180-pound headstone out of there and put it on the hood of the car. So it was like we were chasing a ghost. This guy's invisible.
Le genre de personnes qui procèdent comme ça, donc qui veulent.
The kind of person who proceeds like that, who deliberately puts out clues, makes sure the victim will be recovered quickly and identified. Their main purpose is really to get some attention, improve their self-image, which may be very ordinary, in fact.
2 days later, the killer calls the police and asks them if they liked his gift. The provoking call is made from a payphone booth, only 2 streets from the police station. He disappears yet again without leaving a trace. Witnesses give police descriptions of a man they had seen, but the leads do not produce a suspect. On February 21st, 4 months after the attack, the killer makes contact for the 8th time.
He just picked a residential street. He had walked up to the front of this house and right through the front living room window, he heaved this wrench. Corporal Mike Colson. He is a forensic identification technician for the Abbotsford Police, and he spent a long time very, very carefully taking this package apart. And of course, when you get a letter, the temptation is to rip into the letter and find out what's inside.
Never forget the night we've read that note for the first time, and just chills going up my spine. It was absolutely terrifying, horrific.
The wrench was taped to an envelope with a letter inside. It was typewritten with no punctuation. In it, the killer brags of having committed 3 other attacks. He included newspaper clippings and details that allow the police to confirm his claims. There is no doubt that Tanya and Misty are not his first victims.
He talked about other conquests, and in the end he said, "You won't catch me. I'm not going to move out of town, and I will strike again. And goodbye for now, guys." And it was written sort of almost in a friendly format, so it was really a strange letter.
The forensic expert examines every square millimeter of this package, handling it with extreme care. He finds no prints on the clippings, no prints on the letter, no prints on the envelope. However, on closer examination, the piece of tape holds an obscured clue.
And if you think about tearing a piece of tape off a roll, you're using your thumb and your index finger. And again, looking at the process, normally you would tear a piece of tape with your index finger on the sticky side, and that's what we keyed in on.
They use a new technique designed for difficult media, like adhesive tape.
He used a powder called sticky side powder, which is basically a powder that you mix with a solution that suspends the powder, and then you wash it over the tape, and it'll stick to the glued side of the tape where the finger had touched.
Will the police find the fingerprint of the Abbotsford killer? Has he finally made the fatal mistake that everyone has been waiting for? Abbotsford, British Columbia is on high alert. For the last 5 months, a murderer has been terrorizing the city and provoking the police. He has desecrated the grave of his victim, Tanya Smith, who was found beaten, raped, and drowned. Tanya's friend Misty has survived the attack but is under police protection because the murderer has threatened to kill her. The police examine a letter that the killer had thrown randomly through a house window. The forensic expert applies a special solution designed to detect fingerprints on tape, but he sees nothing. He puts the sample under a microscope, looking for hair or fibers.
That's when he found the fingerprint. It was so faint. So then he photographed it and went in the dark room and just kept on darkening and darkening and darkening until it came up.
The police now have an extremely valuable piece of evidence, an index fingerprint of the Abbotsford killer. The discovery is held back from the media so as to not alert the murderer.
We had DNA and we knew there was a bite mark, but again, we had nothing to compare it to. And not until we found the print did we have something that we could actually start comparing it to suspects.
The print is sent to the Canadian Fingerprint Database for comparison. The result is negative. The print is also sent to the FBI and other American agencies, but again, there are no matches.
Our whole perception of who we were after changed. We were thinking before it would be somebody that had a record for sexual assault or something like that, a known criminal or some kind of criminal record. And in fact, he did not have a criminal record at all.
7 months after the attack, the police digitally enhance the recorded phone calls from the killer and make them public.
We'd set up a phone line at the police office, which is a dial-in line, and you could phone in and listen to the tape to, determine for yourself if you recognized it.
The next day, a woman calls the police.
She phoned our tips line and told one of the tip takers, I think that's my son's voice, and he fishes at the Vedder River, and he went to Tanya Smith's funeral. She knew that.
Could the murder have been turned in by his own mother?
We attended at his residence in Abbotsford and treated him like we treated every other person of interest that had been surfaced through the investigation. And I offered him the chance to come in to talk voluntarily and provide his fingerprints and provide a DNA sample, and he declined to do that.
The investigators are suspicious of his response.
We had very few people that did not cooperate. Anyone that was approached by the police as a suspect or a person of interest were very quick to cooperate, to eliminate themselves, because it was such a horrific crime against a child that no one wanted anything to do with that. And we had some pretty hard-nosed criminals cooperate with us.
The police cannot force a citizen to provide a sample for DNA analysis without a warrant signed by a judge. McLeod continues to investigate the suspect. The man's name is Terry Driver. He is married with 2 young children. He works in a printing house and has no criminal record, and his father is a retired police officer. On the advice of his family, Terry Driver agrees to give his fingerprints, but nothing else. Accompanied by his lawyer, he walks into the police station.
I rolled his prints, but we'd been looking at that print so many times. We had that ingrained in our mind. We knew what we were looking for. Under normal circumstances, I would have taken the print and gone back into my office, but this was a little bit of a unique situation. He had his lawyer there. They wanted it done right there at that spot. So I went into a small office that's normally occupied by the guard and closed the door. But there's windows all around, so you felt like you're in a bit of a fishbowl situation. And they wanted me to make the comparison at that time. There was a center portion of it that had a funny bit of a loop on it, and we kind of had a nickname. We dubbed it the hockey stick. And that was kind of an area that we keyed in on right off the bat to look to see if that formation was there. And when I compared the prints, put the fingerprint glass on it, and started looking at some of the areas that we had keyed in on, I could feel my heart rate was accelerated. And then, of course, when I looked at the print right off the bat, it didn't take me very long, and I knew that it was his print.
Jerry Ennis checks the print again. He is confident that it is identical to the one found on the tape attached to the note signed by the killer. the investigators have their first solid piece of evidence. They can now build the case that Terry Driver is the Abbotsford killer.
Everything from tears in the eye to high fives and hooting and hollering. It was very, very big relief off of everybody's shoulders. And you could tell weight of the world lifted off all of our shoulders because the bad guy was now at least in custody. The threat was over.
When there's an arrest made, as far as the police are concerned, that's really when the work starts. Because now the clock is ticking to get ready for trial.
The police continued to collect evidence against him afterwards. For example, the cell phone tracking evidence, the bite mark comparison evidence was only available when police were able to get his dental impressions. The DNA from him was only available once police knew that it was his DNA they needed to obtain.
It is now up to Crown Prosecutor Neil McKenzie to prove that Terry Driver is guilty. The trial charges him in connection with both victims: attempted murder in the case of Misty Cockerill and first-degree murder in the case of Tanya Smith. Before the court, Terry Driver makes 20 admissions. Most surprisingly, he admits to the rape and manslaughter of Tanya Smith.
Mr. Driver's position was that he was guilty of a sexual assault and guilty of a manslaughter because he had put Tanya Smith's body in the river and she had drowned as a result. And so the manslaughter would be as a result of his unlawful act of putting her body in the river. He claimed at that time that he believed that she was already dead and only realized later that she had drowned when he heard news reports. So then he realized that he was responsible for the death, and that was why he, according to him, was guilty of manslaughter but not of murder.
I think what he said on the stand was that he had sex with Tanya. That's consistent with the evidence. But then there's no direct evidence that says that he was the person that threw her in the river and in fact killed her because she drowned.
What went against that, of course, was the fact that he'd written a letter talking about a baseball bat. And he had talked about being the one that took Misty around to the front of the hospital and dropping her off. And in fact, he hadn't done that. Justice Opal came up with a number of reasons that he found his story not credible. And he convicted him.
It is almost exactly 2 years after the attack on the teenage victims. Terry Driver is convicted of first-degree murder in the case of Tanya Smith and attempted murder in the case of Misty Cockerill. He receives a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years, which is the minimum for first-degree murder. At a separate trial, Terry Driver is also found guilty of the 3 attacks that he confessed to in the note thrown through the window.
Basically, members of the team put their lives on hold for 7 months and went after this case to investigate it and identify the killer. These guys lived in the community. We all lived in the community. We all knew the threat, and the threat was to our families as well. And it was one of those cases that if it comes along once in your career, that would be too much.
Terry Driver used water to become the Abbotsford killer and forever left a scar on the community. But for Tanya and Misty, justice has been served. It was one of the most notorious crimes in Canadian history. A crime so evil and chilling, it captivated the people of Southern Ontario for more than a year. This case is protected by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The identities of the victim, the defendants, and the witnesses cannot be revealed. Mississauga, Ontario is a quiet Toronto suburb. On January 18, 2003 at 10:35 p.m., a 911 call is received at the Peel Regional District Call Center. A distraught young girl tells the operator that her mother has drowned in the bathtub. The police and emergency response teams are dispatched to a house in a middle-class neighborhood. The two hysterical teenage sisters open the door. They point to the upstairs bathroom and tell the emergency personnel that their mother has drowned in the bathtub. The paramedics pull her body from the tub and attempt to resuscitate the mother, but she is unresponsive. They cover her body with a sheet and leave it for the coroner to examine when he arrives.
Right from the beginning, bathtub drownings don't occur very often, and so they have to be looked at with a degree of suspicion. So this was a suspicious death. I still have difficulty with believing that people drown in bathtubs on their own. I know it's possible to it, but I still have that mindset going in that until I prove it to myself, I don't believe it.
Forensic Identification Officer Bernie Weber arrives at the house. His first task is to observe and photograph the scene.
I actually arrived just shortly before the coroner. And so I go in, I photograph everything the way that I find it. I don't touch anything, I don't move anything. I don't even take the blanket off of the deceased. And I don't even want to get in to start moving anything until the coroner gives me that sort of authorization. I want him to see the scene the way that I have. We still didn't know exactly what we were dealing with. I did some photographs in other areas of the home, one which showed the living room, where everything was relatively neat and tidy, but there was a vodka bottle which was lying on its side on the coffee table.
While Weber continues his inventory of the scene, Inspector Brent Magnus begins his preliminary investigation. He will be the first person to record the sisters' version of the events.
Was your mother in the tub?
They tell him they went to meet friends for dinner at Jack Astor's restaurant around 6 p.m. When they left, their mother was drinking heavily.
And then what happened?
When they returned around 10:30, they were shocked to find their mother unconscious, face down in the bathtub.
During that brief interview or talking with the girls, they requested to go to the aunts. She agreed that the girls could stay with her. It was close by, and it was easy to take them to a place of safety.
The girls are escorted to their aunt's house nearby.
That scene was initially identified as a sudden death scene, and the coroner would have responsibility over that particular scene.
The coroner arrives. He and Bernie Weber begin to reconstruct the sequence of events.
A normal size between 5'2" and 5'5". She was slightly overweight. Whenever you start to move a body and they talk about that dead weight, it would have been very difficult, actually, even just for her small size to try to get her out of the bathtub like the fire department did. So for things not to be completely knocked over within the bathroom wasn't a surprise. It was actually still relatively in order. So I was asked by the coroner to fingerprint her in order to identify her. I take a dark fingerprint powder on a brush. I put the powder onto the skin itself, and then what I do is I put a piece of tape over top of that finger, and then as I pull it away, I get that impression. So I'm left with the fingerprint impression, and I can use that for comparison.
They are looking for clues that will tell them whether this was an accident or a homicide. In a case like this, the tiniest clue can take the investigation in a whole new direction. What has appeared to be just an accident can suddenly turn into a cold-blooded murder.
She had a little bit of liquid coming out of her mouth, which is very common in all drowning cases because that's the normal process of the body getting rid of the liquid.
Nos poumons, dans une noyade.
When a person drowns, there is moisture in the lungs. Some of it may come from the water they drowned in, but some also comes from their own body. The blood draws it into the lungs because of the lack of oxygen. That moisture is rich in proteins because there are a lot of proteins in the blood, and some of them will cross into the lungs. Those proteins get mixed with the air. So when you press the lungs, foam comes out. You see that foam in the respiratory tract, but even before you begin the autopsy, often there is a big mushroom of foam around the nose and the mouth.
Before long, Weber and the coroner begin to notice details that arouse their suspicions.
We started to see things like we had 2 different glasses within the bathroom itself that had alcohol in it. I started to make other observations within the tub itself. There was 6 inches of water depth within the tub. So with the body in there, it would have obviously displaced, but the water had cooled down to air temperature. So I would expect in a normal situation, if it had been a normal bath, that the water would have been warmer.
The water temperature will help determine the time of death.
It's just a matter of process. Whenever you're dealing with a drowning, a water sample should always be taken at that time, and so that's what I did there. But also in the bottom of the tub, there was a granular material, and that appeared to be either vomitous or fecal matter that had just mixed in with the water. This was not collected at that time because we were still in that process of trying to determine what sort of death that we had. So that was left in there because if something suspicious had come out of the post-mortem examination, I knew that we would be returning to the home under a criminal code warrant, and we could grab that at that time.
The mother's body shows no signs of struggle, and no evidence of foul play can be found. But the investigators still consider this a suspicious death.
We were hoping that something would come out of the post-mortem examination that would lead us to conclude one way or the other.
The house is sealed off until after the autopsy. Police officers are posted to ensure that no one can enter the home and that all potential evidence remains intact. So far, everything seems to point to an accidental drowning. But in cases such as this, the final determination cannot be made until the autopsy has been completed. It is often the pathologist who finds evidence of foul play. Mississauga, Ontario. A woman is discovered in her bathtub by her 15 and 16-year-old daughters. The investigators are very suspicious since bathtub drownings are extremely rare. An autopsy is ordered to determine the cause of death. Back in his office, Bernie Weber prepares his report. It will be used by the pathologist at the autopsy the following day. He compares the victim's fingerprints to those in the RCMP database to confirm her identity.
I wanted to ensure that she was in fact the lady that we thought she was. I was able to pull the fingerprints. I made that comparison. And then I subsequently notified the coroner, identified this lady, as well as the officer in charge.
The following day, Dr. Timothy Feltis prepares for the autopsy.
I've done about almost 4,000 medical legal cases over my career. Drowning actually is still not that common. I've probably done perhaps maybe 25 drownings, and I've done maybe 6 or 7 that have occurred in a bathtub. From a forensic pathology point of view, any death in a bathtub is highly suspicious. It's unusual for people to die in a bathtub full of water. Automatically, we treated this as a homicide right from the get-go. A homicide autopsy in this case, with a death in water, meant that we had to do some very specific things. We'll take blood samples that will be used for toxicology. We'll take urine samples that will be used for toxicology. We also take a sample of stomach contents. That's kind of a backup in this case. We don't usually use the stomach contents all the time, and it is submitted to the Center for Forensic Science. In this case, we also took an extra sample of blood and took it up to our pathology lab and ran it for alcohol. Often when people die in a bathtub, they may be strangled. So that means we have to do what's called a dry neck dissection, whereby we remove the chest and abdominal organs and the brain before we even go near the neck. That is so that we decrease any chance of introducing artifactual blood into the neck by removing those organs. Secondly, we would obviously make a very, very detailed search of that body for any evidence of trauma, including bruising, scratches, abrasions, etc.
What we're seeing is blood vessels deep down that have ruptured, so blood has collected there. Through the skin, we see the bluish or reddish area. The medical term is ecchymosis, but in everyday language, we call it a bruise. But if the area where there is bleeding is very small or very deep, or if the skin is very dark, sometimes the injuries aren't visible. So as a precaution, we open all the tissue in the back and the back of the legs to see whether there are any injuries we have missed.
The other thing that's important in this case to realize is that this woman who died was considered to be an alcoholic. Often, in alcoholic people, we will see evidence of bruising from various falls. What's interesting in this case is that there are no old bruises on this woman's body. Now, that doesn't mean that she isn't an alcoholic. She may be what are called a careful drunk. So I would have expected in this case that if there's a long history of alcoholism, that we might have seen evidence of previous falls with some bruising. That was not evident in this case at all.
The results of the blood analysis have returned from the lab.
We immediately, during the course of the autopsy, knew that this woman had a significantly elevated blood alcohol level in the range of 400 milligrams per 100 mLs. That is a potentially fatal level of alcohol.
Levels of only 325 milligrams per 100 milliliters can be fatal to an average person.
Now, somebody who's a chronic alcoholic might be very much different, but it's certainly a level under which somebody might pass out in a bathtub and accidentally drown. If you've taken enough alcohol and it depresses your central nervous system, it might suppress the cough response you have to get that water out of your lungs, and so that you can take the water in, the water just flows in a lot more easily than it would if you weren't inebriated with alcohol. Any death in a bathtub has to be suspicious. All the findings was we had this high level of alcohol in a relatively young woman who had signs of freshwater drowning and no evidence of trauma. We didn't have any evidence that directly pointed to a homicide. You need absolute proof, and in terms of the autopsy, there wasn't any.
The coroner compares the autopsy results with his own observations and the testimony of the victim's daughters. He concludes that the cause of death was accidental drowning due to excessive alcohol consumption. Peel District Police closed the file. The sister's aunt becomes their legal guardian. The girls inherit nearly $200,000 from their mother's life insurance policy. However, 11 months later, a surprising piece of evidence is brought to the attention of the Peel police, and the case is reopened. In Mississauga, Ontario, a woman is discovered drowned in her bathtub. Her teenage daughters find her body and call the police. In Investigators are very suspicious because bathtub drownings are extremely rare. A full investigation, autopsy, and toxicology are carried out. The coroner concludes that it's an accidental drowning due to toxic levels of alcohol, and the case is closed. "11 months later, a teenage boy contacts the police with surprising information about the bathtub drowning.
This individual received some information from the older of the two sisters. He became aware of certain information and that the mother had actually been murdered or forcibly drowned in the bathtub of the residence.
Brent Magnus must first prove that the young man is telling the truth.
I discussed it with a Crown attorney because initially when this information came forward through the friend, I realized that we would have to go to an authorization to intercept communications in order to corroborate what this friend was telling us.
The police examine the young man's computer. They find online conversations between him and the older sister that are very disturbing.
He was providing us information that only the girls would be privy to, and that they had actually murdered their mother.
The case is reopened and becomes a criminal investigation. The police begin to plan an undercover operation with the young man playing the lead role. Even though he has been friends with the sisters for many years, this operation could put his life at risk.
He had been a longtime friend of the girls. Both families growing up were fairly close.
The police provide the young man with a car wired with audio and video recording equipment.
He acted pretty much in a capacity as an agent for the police, and through some guidance with an agent handler, was able to meet with the girls and again engage both girls in conversation relating to the murder.
During the next 4 weeks, the young informant records many incriminating conversations with the sisters.
He went out to meet the older of the two sisters. He obtained a statement from her with respect to the murders, and it was obvious from reviewing and transcribing that entire intercept that the older sister and possibly the younger sister were definitely involved in the murder of their mother.
The first intercepted conversation is chilling. The older sister openly reveals details of the murder that they had been planning for months.
I think initially you don't want to believe that a 15 and 16-year-old would murder a parent, and especially their mother.
I mean, the videotape that the police set up was brilliant because these girls had no idea they were being videotaped. In fact, at one point, I think it's the older girl, she gets into the car and the first thing she says to their friend is, I'm not being videotaped, am I?
The sisters came from a broken home. For many years, their mother had been turning to alcohol to deaden the pain of 2 failed marriages.
They were able to use the mother's weaknesses against her, which was the recent relationship breakup with her boyfriend. When this occurred, she would consume alcohol.
Over the course of a few weeks, the young informant meets the sisters 4 times. The meetings produce many hours of recordings and dozens of leads that must be followed up. One startling discovery comes out in the first recording. The girls had given their mother deadly cocktails of vodka and Tylenol 3, a potent painkiller containing high levels of codeine.
We realized we should do a toxicology test looking specifically for codeine.
A warrant is issued to release the blood and urine samples taken from the mother a year earlier.
A full analysis on the samples and relayed to us that the mother had an abnormal amount of codeine in her system at the time of her death.
The investigators have the proof they need. The next step is to plan how to arrest the sisters and their accomplices.
I had officers assigned to find out what schools they went to and any other background information we could dig up on them.
The police are concerned that news of the arrests will spread quickly through the community. They're afraid the accomplices might have the opportunity to consolidate their alibis.
Because the younger generation of people are in communication with one another more readily through cell phones, through Blackberries, internet, it wouldn't take a very long period of time for individuals to realize that the girls were arrested.
It would be difficult to prevent accomplices from communicating online and covering up important information. The investigators had to come up with a fail-safe strategy. In Mississauga, Ontario, 2 teenage girls report that their mother has drowned at home in the bathtub. At the time, it is determined that the death was due to excessive alcohol intoxication, and it's ruled accidental. The case is closed. 1 year later, the police received disturbing information suggesting the death was not an accident. With the help of an informant, the police obtained enough evidence to trap the 2 teenage killers. On January 21st at 7 a.m., the police served warrants for the arrest of the 2 sisters for the murder of their mother. The sisters are taken into custody, still dressed in their pajamas.
They were brought into the homicide area of Peel Regional Police. They were obviously separated. We did not want them talking or influencing each other during that process. I had officers obtain specific clothing for them so that they would be dressed appropriately. They both declined to wear anything but the pajamas that they were wearing when they were arrested. At the same time, I had approximately 50 to 55 officers that were out involved in the execution of the search warrant at the residence, searching the residence, and I had identified approximately 45 other individuals that I needed interviewed within a very short period of time. Anybody I thought could provide us information on the girls or the murder of the mother, and I had to keep in the back of my mind to have the girls' family interviewed first.
The conversations intercepted by the informant show that the girls had been speaking openly with their friends about the crime that they had committed.
Young people who commit this type of crime and brag about it afterwards face a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to prove that they are capable of action, that they're not all talk. But on the other hand, the more they talk about it, the more they risk getting caught.
Detective Magnus wanted to make sure he was able to question the immediate family members before the 2 accused could talk to them. He had to ensure that a lawyer was present when the 2 girls were being interrogated.
They were given the opportunity to speak with counsel almost immediately. Any other adult or family member that they would feel confident in speaking with, and they were given the opportunity to have those individuals present with them during any interview that would take place.
Right from the start, both sisters denied any involvement in their mother's death. But it soon becomes apparent to the police that the older sister is extremely nervous. After several hours of questioning, she finally breaks down in tears. She admits to her role in the murder and describes it in detail. Then, remarkably, she curls up on the floor and falls asleep.
That's not uncommon. I've been involved in several arrests where individuals have an adrenaline dump or some type of change physically, that once they have been arrested, they, for some reason, fall asleep.
But the younger sister continues to deny any involvement in her mother's drowning.
No, after several hours of speaking with her, she did not provide any information to police. However, the two girls wanted to speak with one another. I made the decision to allow that to happen, and they did speak to one another about the murder.
They put the two girls together, and they come up with this scheme about how they were going to pretend it was all a big joke they were putting on their friend, and that's the story they're going to tell the police. So they come back into the rooms again, and she says, well, can you be in trouble for lying to police? And the officer says, well, what do you mean lying? He says, well, I didn't kill my mother, I was just lying to you.
The older sister's retraction leaves the investigators with just one promising lead: the logs of the online chat stored on the girls' computer hard drives. Joe Colson from the Technological Crime Unit examines the computers.
They're taken back to the Technological Crime Lab, and the computers themselves are physically taken apart, at which time we forensically image the hard drive. Basically, we copy the drive from start to finish. Every bit is copied. We do it in such a way that we can prove that the image that we have taken is identical to the original computer, and we do all our work from the forensic copy of that drive. When you delete something from your computer, that file, pretty much in its entirety, is still resident on that computer. A typical user will go in and say, okay, I should delete that now. As far as the chat goes, you can physically go in and delete that chat, but again, with the software programs that we use, sometimes we can recover that.
As Colson recovers the files, he begins to piece together the girl's sinister story. And it's not exactly what the investigators had expected.
These two girls were brilliant kids. One of their guidance counselors said that they were the most intelligent kids that he'd ever seen in 30 years of teaching. But he said their best quality was their ability to manipulate people.
Their online chats paint a picture of an unhappy family life. Their mother had been in 2 difficult relationships with abusive men. They accused their mother of spending more money on alcohol than on their well-being. They began to fantasize about a better life without their mother.
Within a very short period of time, their entire lifestyle started to change. Around the time that they came up with the plan, they started hanging out with different people than they used to. They started skipping school, started using drugs and alcohol. I realized after examining some of the intercepts that this was actually not a spur-of-the-moment homicide or murder, that this was planned and calculated, researched by both individuals. The mother, unbeknownst to the girls, was saving money for them, providing them a good home life, and working several jobs to provide that. The girls didn't recognize that. Once the girls sat down and came up with the idea of killing their mother for insurance monies, I believe they hatched the plan through research and talking with some friends.
Probably the most important part of the analysis on this case was keywords and the analysis of keyword hits on these drives.
The investigators used specially designed software to help them sift through the enormous volume of data.
All of their conversations were being logged on the computer. I don't know whether they knew it was logged or not, but it was being logged on their computer. The first hit that we got was alcohol effects and Tylenol. And that was sort of that first glimpse. When I found that first shred of evidence, that first smoking gun, there was the adrenaline. And it was like, there it is.
Came up with the idea of getting her intoxicated and providing her pills to incapacitate her. They actually did research into the amount of alcohol, the amount of Tylenol or codeine and its effects mixed with alcohol, and the amount of time necessary to drown a person or hold them underwater to facilitate a murder.
The police recover information that proves the girls had been actively planning their mother's murder for months. But the two sisters had not acted alone.
We were able to show that the girls were actually chatting with this particular individual, and that he was willing to be an alibi for the two girls. He actually did show up the night of the murder at a local restaurant to act as an alibi.
The young accomplice was also a lifeguard. He was well aware of how easy it is to drown someone.
He provided the one sister with Tylenol pills, sufficient enough to incapacitate the mother along with the alcohol.
For an entire year, the sisters have managed to get away with the perfect crime. Now the time has come for the investigators to build the perfect prosecution. Southern Ontario is shocked by the news that a one-year-old accidental drowning case has been escalated to murder. The accused are two teenage sisters from Mississauga. They are arrested and charged with drowning their mother. After months in a detention center, the two sisters are accompanied by their lawyers to their bail hearing. Surprisingly, they are still wearing their pajamas.
I've covered, hundreds and hundreds of cases, the last 10, 15 covering crime, and I'd never ever seen two girls so young show up in court dressed in their pajamas, especially two girls who were allegedly arrested for killing their mother. And I thought, what's going on here?
Their immediate family and circle of friends believe the police have made a terrible mistake.
In fact, during the bail hearing, there was laughter throughout the whole courtroom. The father didn't believe it, the aunt certainly didn't believe it, their cousins thought it was a big joke.
After their hearing, their lawyers talked to the media.
Their lawyers came out and said that, these poor girls were wrestled out of bed and they weren't allowed to dress, and the cops did this, and it's just a terrible story. And of course, what we didn't know at the time was the girls lived in their pajamas, refused to get dressed, and had spent the better part of the day before just sparring with seasoned interviewers about what happened.
Masters of manipulation, the sisters begin to sway public opinion using their lawyers, family, and friends.
There was a lot of media coverage. Young girls killing their mother, how could that happen? Let's feel sorry, it must have been their lifestyle, the mother must have been abusive. Some 4 months after their arrest, they were given bail with specific conditions placed on them by the judge. And one of those conditions was being to remain within the residence where they were residing, which was the aunt's house.
The girls are released from the detention center and placed under house arrest with their aunt until the trial.
It just meant that they weren't free to do anything they wanted. I mean, they could go to school if they could have. They could have gone to doctor appointments. They could go to work if they wanted. They just had to be with somebody chaperoning them.
Some of the computers were given back to the family. We actually obtained a lot of the evidence from a computer that had been brought with them from their previous residence.
The sisters continue their deception. The family still believes the girls are innocent, but their online chats tell a completely different story.
And they spend that entire year living at the aunt's house. And this is the aunt whose sister they have killed. And everybody supports them. They think the police have made a terrible mistake.
With the same computers they used to hatch their diabolical plan, the sisters continue their online chats and brag about how they've been able to fool everyone. When the investigation is complete, the sisters' cruel, clever plan is finally brought to light. While the sisters are under house arrest, the logs of their previous online chats are examined with a fine-tooth comb. Investigators are then able to piece together a detailed timeline of the events that led up to the murder. The evidence clearly proves that the sisters had planned to kill their mother in cold blood.
It's our belief that the girls poured drinks for the mother, provided her pills, which was not abnormal for them to do that.
The mixture of alcohol and codeine from the Tylenol 3 soon puts their mother in an almost unconscious state. While their mother is heavily sedated, the sisters fill the tub and prepare the bathroom. They help their mother up the stairs, taking great care that she doesn't fall and bruise herself. The older sister helps her mother climb into the tub. Telephone and computer records proved that the sisters were communicating with their friends as they prepared to drown their mother. The older sister puts on latex gloves, then holds her mother's head under 15 centimeters of water until she stops breathing. The sisters rush out of the house. In order to establish an alibi, they have arranged to meet a girlfriend and their accomplice, the lifeguard, at a local restaurant. After dinner, they return home and stage their 911 call.
The older sister makes the call, the younger sister is in the background. The older sister sounds like she is upset. But when you review that with other evidence in the case, you realize that she was play acting. 911 operators asked the girls to provide the mother assistance if they found her just drowned in the tub. When police first responded, there was some evidence of rigidity, rigor mortis, and lividity, which would indicate that it had transpired several hours prior to the girls calling 911.
One year after their arrest, the trial begins. They become known as the Bathtub Sisters.
People ask me, was this a hard trial to sit through? And you must have been, aghast by all this. Every day, myself and other reporters that covered it couldn't wait to get to the courtroom because we just couldn't wait to find out what was going to come next. The Crown attorneys would say, if you thought this was good, stay tuned.
The sisters have two motives for their crime. One is to escape from an abusive home life and an alcoholic parent. The other is just plain greed. They know their mother has a life insurance policy worth nearly $200,000.
That's what makes this whole thing bizarre, chilling, disturbing. Yeah, there were 3 close friends who knew it was going to happen beforehand, knew afterwards. Nobody ever goes to their parents, nobody goes to police, nobody goes to any authority figure whatsoever. And I think during that whole year they got away with it. There had to be hundreds of kids in 2 different high schools that either suspected they had killed their mother or knew firsthand they had done it, but nobody ever tells anybody.
Their accomplices eventually testify against the girls and help to convict them. The young male accomplice is also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. As the trial progresses, the police continue to bring forward new evidence found on the seized computers.
The technical evidence added so much validity and so much weight to these other witnesses' statements because we were able to corroborate what these witnesses were saying. The digital evidence in this particular case really became the crux of the case. To my knowledge, this is probably one of the foremost technical investigations that took place in this country at that time.
After a trial lasting several weeks, Justice Bruce Duncan hands down his decision.
Their mother is obviously...
He says the 2 defendants set out to commit the perfect crime, but instead, they created the perfect prosecution. The case against them is overwhelming. He declares that this is the strongest case he has ever seen in over 30 years of prosecuting and judging criminal cases. He finds the defendants guilty of first-degree murder.
They were convicted as youth under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It meant that all they could serve was a maximum of 10 years. First-degree murder, that's the most you can serve. You can only serve a maximum of 6 years in custody. The rest can be served in a halfway house, even in their own house under house arrest eventually. When they get released after that 10-year period is up, they can go anywhere in Canada. They don't really need to get new names because nobody will know their names. But for the average public, they'll always be known as the Bathtub Girls.
I feel strongly that everybody came to the same conclusion that these 2 girls were evil.
The horrific thing about this is that these were 15 and 16-year-old kids, and they almost got away with the perfect crime.
The deadly power of water was used to cover up an almost perfect crime. The mother's drowning would have gone unpunished had it not been for one person following his conscience. Once again, water would have been a ruthless accomplice. Silent. Perfect.